The Defense Department wants to spur research by students to take on national security questions. 2 DoD-backed academic groups will help that happen. It established a partnership between a federally funded research and development center at MIT and the National Strategic Research Institute at the University of Nebraska. For what happens next, Research Director at the Institute, Dave Roberts. Mr. Roberts, good to have you with us.
Hi, thank you. Nice to be here.
And tell us more about this partnership. I mean, that's a pretty distant partnership, the University of Nebraska and MIT.
Yeah, it actually is. It's really been, I want to say, a blessing in disguise to have these two major players actually collaborate together, and that's essentially what this initiative that we're supporting is. So I'm part of a UARC called the National Strategic Research Institute, and we're partnered with the University of Nebraska, and we're standing up a collaboration partnership program with MIT Lincoln Laboratories, who's a federally funded research and development center. And what we're doing is we're attacking sort of national security questions for the DoD by leveraging new innovative approaches. So this joint initiative brings together sort of the scientific expertise and cutting-edge capabilities that students have both at the University of Nebraska, which is sort of well known for agricultural and food and agricultural components, and then, of course, MIT, who is widely known as an engineering, hub and expertise as well, too. So this is really a good chance for these two entities to come together and develop these groundbreaking solutions to detect and neutralize emerging biological threats.
Now, the University of Nebraska and MIT are both perfectly capable of getting research grants on their own that involve students. What does the FFRDC and Lincoln Labs as kind of the granddaddy of them, or among the granddaddies of those types of organizations, and your institute bring? What is the additional overlay required for?
The initiative, or at least the hook, if you will, Tom, that we have is exposure. So you're right. MIT and Nebraska both have their capabilities and their abilities to go after research dollars. But we often find that, they're pretty much thinking in their backyard. They're thinking about Nebraska topics, Nebraska ideas. MIT is often dealing with, MIT-related programs, but they don't often collaborate with others. And so we want to sort of facilitate this collaboration and dive into this a little bit deeper to try to understand better what these two entities collectively can bring to the table when it comes to addressing some of these sort of global concerns that we have.
And how will this work? In other words, the DoD has a million problems it's trying to solve. And will they use your organizations, the partnership, as kind of a go-to place for a project-by-project type of basis?
So what the approach is, they're basically wanting to fund basic research, and it's really supported in two major initiatives. One is collaboration. I think we all can attest that we are experts in our relative fields, but we surely don't know everything. And so every time we involve new thoughts, new thought leaders outside of the fence line, if you will, it just provides a well-rounded approach. But the other component that I think is very attractive for DoD is the workforce development aspect of it all. We've got a lot of very knowledgeable people that work at the U.S. government, but at some point we all hope that we'll retire and they will eventually, bow out of service, and we need new, fresh blood, if you will, and ideas to come in and replace those experts that can help drive initiatives moving forward with, these initiatives working at with this particular effort is surrounded around global health and food and ag. And those are the two areas that have been the focus for this year's efforts, is to look at those two elements.
And with respect to workforce development, does that mean people doing the research, the students doing the research, would be trained for work they might do for the federal government as federal employees, or simply developing skills in areas that are in demand both by government and industry and academia, for that matter?
So, you know what? The answer to your question is yes to all of those. The part is to get students, both graduate and undergraduate, exposed to government work. I think there's this, I shouldn't say a stigma, but I think there's this idea of what it's like to work for the government. And then, it's usually facilitated by movies that we've watched where you're kind of, into the basement of this flickering light type of research environment. And that's not necessarily the reality of things. So this helpfully gives them exposure to what the federal government is looking for. And it also gives the federal government an exposure to new researchers and seeing the product of the research, and potentially even mentoring them to bring them over as part of, the U.S. government workforce to address some of these ideas.
We're speaking with Dave Roberts. He's Research Director for Special Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute, connected to the University of Nebraska. And what are the signals you're getting from DoD? What is their interest in areas of global health and food and nutrition and so forth? What's the specific DoD tie-in to those topics? Because they're pretty broad.
They are. And, when it comes to like food and agricultural safety, we go back to the National Security Memorandum 16 that President Biden signed in on November 10th of 2022, which is the security and resilience for the food and agricultural component. So this ties back to that memorandum. And then, when it comes to the global health piece, we can actually refer to something very recent, which is COVID, right? I think COVID basically gave the world a wake-up call as to the impacts of a pandemic and what that has to do with disease and what, the global systems has as an impact. And then just, it kind of brought global health back into the front and center for review. So these two elements, at least right now, seem to be the most obtainable and directly referenced to some initiatives that are happening within the government right now.
And are there any specific projects underway at this point?
So there is right now, currently, one of the things that MIT is working on is taking a look at, I'm a microbiologist by training, so this relates back to some of my education, I should say, but a lot of the bacteria that we're all familiar with are culturable, which means we can grow them up in a laboratory setting. But there are thousands and thousands of bacteria that we're just not able to actually grow. And one of the reasons why is they are all very unique in what the requirements are for them to actually grow. MIT's approach to this is to create a 96 well microenvironment where they can basically take these 96 individual wells and customize the atmosphere in each of those wells on a very small scale so that you can have a very high throughput on identifying bacteria that we've historically not been able to culture. But now with this type of system, we are able to do that. Some of those applications can be transferred over to the agricultural side that Nebraska is so familiar with, which is looking at the rumen of cattle and looking at the microenvironments of that rumen and how do we explore that and address some of the food safety things that we've seen even as of recently with the H5N1 situation that's going on right now across the cattle and the exposure of that. So definitely, the work that's being performed right now has direct ties to current applications and are very effective at what we're trying to address right now.
Is there a biological warfare angle possibility to this? Because not every nation that is becoming our near peer or pacing adversary is necessarily going to pay attention to the Geneva Conventions.
Sure, no, and I understand that. But right now, this is our year one here, Tom, I should say. There's been no discussion about that. Now, obviously, as years progress, that's the one thing I'd like to emphasize to you is this isn't just a one-year initiative, I should say. This is a multi-year effort at which as elements change and as the framework, to your point, changes from one year to the next, that focus may shift from food and ag and global health to maybe something more of a biological threat component. But again, this project is looking at basic research, so there's really no specific targets that we're trying to address other than to improve both global health and agricultural safety.
And my final question to you as a microbiologist, should we worry more about viruses or bacteria?
My opinion on that one, Tom, is viruses. I mean, we've seen that with COVID. They change very quickly. In some cases, they're very robust. And because of their ability to adapt very quickly, we've all been very exposed to this with COVID, with all the variant strains that are out there, I should say. You couldn't almost turn your head without seeing another variant out there, right? So, yeah, I mean, right now, viruses scare me. I'm not a virologist, but they definitely scare me right now more than bacteria. That will keep me up at night, Tom.
Dave Roberts is Research Director for Special Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute at the University of Nebraska. Thanks so much for joining me.
Sure. Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate your time on this.
We'll post this interview along with a link to more information at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Hear the Federal Drive on demand. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.